Hi, my name is Mona Jamshed, and I'm going to introduce you to a series of lectures on a software engineering course called Requirements Engineering. I delivered this course to a group of students of Bachelors of Software Engineering at University of Adelaide in the year 2022. This course covers the foundation of requirements specification of a software product. I taught the course in different sections, and it started from understanding requirements specification, understanding the client's needs, analyzing those needs, testing and validation of those needs, prototyping, and management. The slides that I have used have originally been prepared by Professor Dagmar Monnet, who is a professor of computer sciences at the Berlin School of Economics and Law. She has very kindly provided these slides for teaching purposes and has also allowed the modification. So a slight modification has been done to suit the needs of the students. I've tried to teach this course in a very basic manner using everyday examples. I hope you enjoy this series and you're able to learn something about requirements engineering. Also, you will be seeing this clip at the beginning of each of the lectures that I'll be uploading under this lecture series. Happy studying. This requirements management is basically telling you that there is a dire need of managing your requirements, because you're never going to get that elusive goal of perfect requirements. But what you need to do is making sure that your team members have a shared understanding of requirements, and it's good enough to, that can allow you to work on the next portion of the project. And one reason why we need to manage our requirements is so that we don't have to do any unplanned rework. And I just gave an example where the developer spends a lot of time on incorporating a new feature based on the SRS version that he had, and it turns out that he did not have the latest version of that document, and it wasn't needed in the first place when he had a meeting with his project manager. So in order to avoid all these confusions and frustrations and avoid wasting people's time, it's really important that we work on making sure that our requirements are all updated and that we get to work only on what's required. So these are the main topics that we are going to cover for today. And like it says here, requirements version control, requirements change control, status tracking, tracing, measuring your efforts, managing requirements in agile projects, and requirement management tools. So it's basically chapter number 27 that we are going to cover for this course. They have one or two slides have been taken from chapter 30, as well. They are mostly related to the tools, so that's something we can even discuss tomorrow in the workshop. We'll try to cover the required chapter for today. Okay, so again, this cartoon, let's read it together, and just an illustration of if there is no way of how to track, if there is no culture in your company of tracking the requirements, then you're going to end up having a conversation like this. So it's probably the business analyst. He's asking, did you make the changes I asked for? Well, that depends. Do you remember what you asked me to change? Sorry, I think it's the customer here who's asking. And Dilbert, as the business analyst, said, do you remember what you asked me to change? And he says, no. So, yep, I made the changes. So obviously, if something is in the air and something was discussed and never put down in a way that it can be tracked, and it can be put in a document, or it was not documented, or there was no issue tracking involved in the requirement, then there will be a lot of problem and a lot of gap in what the customer was expecting to happen and what ultimately the developers team got done. So some of the key activities in requirements management are, we will be discussing some of techniques, tools, and conventions for distinguishing the versions of individual requirements. So and it can be both for your individual and your requirement set. So Simple way of saying is that, for example, in your course, you prepared an SRS document, and if you're working on it further, you will be putting a version number on each, on the latest document. How to approve and baseline requirements. So this means baselining is like a set of requirements that has been reviewed, agreed upon, and it serves as the basis for your further development, right? So it even involves, like, there can be an agreement that all the parties can sign off, where they say that, yes, these are the requirements that we have discussed, and they will be sent for further development. So those requirements will be titled as your baseline requirements. And yeah, baselining the requirements basically means that this is the best understanding of the requirements amongst all the stakeholders to work on the next portion of the project, okay? Then we'll talk about change control policies and procedures. That's also one of the activities in requirement management, assessing the ripple effects of the changes in requirements. So once a change takes place, and if it hasn't been documented, then how can it impact the entire requirement engineering framework? Requirement attributes, each requirement has an attribute, and each requirement can be tracked according to its status. We'll talk about that. Updating the requirements trace information, tracking and resolving requirement issues, and ensuring that there is an appropriate link between, obviously, that's what you really need to take care, that as you're managing your requirements and incorporating new requirements, deleting new requirements, deferring some requirements, every activity has to be aligned with the project plan, all right? So, requirements management key activities. So this is again taken from your book, and it shows the core activities in requirement management. They mainly fall under 4 categories. You can see there's one, a version control, that's how you can manage. Then there is a change control. Then there is requirements status tracking that you can do, and then tracing. So you have maybe a tracing tool with which you are able to, you and your team are able to track a requirement throughout its journey. Okay. To be honest, this this chapter is like, I mean, it's a lot of common sense, and it's just like, you know, when you are writing something and then how you edit your work, and how you, for example, if it's an author, and if he's coming up with the first edit, the first version, the first draft of his book or a chapter, and then he works and makes some edits in it, and then that's a second draft, and then his editor reads it, and then, you know, like finally it comes up to the final version. So that's basically it, even in requirement engineering. So, but yeah, I think it's not part of your, like, the workload for your course. Anyway, okay. So requirements version control. We'll now talk about one of these key activities of requirements management. So the first column, version control. Okay, so as it is, we have all agreed that no matter how much of analysis, categorization, and specification we do, we can end up having all sorts of problems if the team members, even starting from your customer to your role as a business analyst, to your developer, your marketer, your tester, if they all have multiple versions of the same document, right? And we are not sure which one is up to date and which one is accurate. And the example that we just discussed in the beginning, where the tester, he is meeting his project manager, sorry, the developer, and he's saying that I've invested a lot of time in this, and it's finally, this feature has been put up, and he's told that, well, sorry, it wasn't really needed. So he didn't do it like inadvertently, right? He thought that he's having the correct version of that SRS document. But what happens is that if we inadvertently use an out-of-date version of the document, then things do get out of control, right? For that purpose, we need to have a version control. And what is a version control? How do we implement it in a project? It's like you are basically managing multiple variations of the same document, okay? And it's all about knowing what each version of the document is and what is the current status of that version control, so that we all have a clear record of when was the document originally created, when was it developed, and what changes have taken over time, and when have those changes occurred, right? So, which means we are incorporating the date, the version, and the changes in this requirement version control. And it's applicable to both the individual as well as a set of requirements. Second point is that each circulated version of the requirement in a requirements document should have a version history captured. So, and updated. So it's like you're doing whatever changes were made, when they were made. So you're incorporating all those changes and who made those changes, who approved those changes, and then when they were, when those changes were made. So it's like a table you can make, and you can put all these updated version, or basically you're going to capture the entire history of how the requirement version, how the changes are taking place and what's the updated status. So the third point, a version control process should be supported by a tool. Now, as it is, there are many documents that can help you do that, or there are now many software applications that can help, and there's a plethora of information out there on the internet when you want to incorporate this version control in it. So yeah, we are not short of tools for sure. So this entire process can be supported by a tool which can help you capture the change history and help you make a rationale for the decisions that you make. And so, for example, one of them is like the requirement management tools. They track the history of all the changes that have been made to every requirement. And I think it's really valuable for all your team members to know what was the original version of the requirement, and then how and when were the changes made, so that if anyone wants to have a look at the earlier version, that's available to them. So the requirement management tools, they also allow for making a comment against each version. As you're updating your requirements, you can also make a comment against it. So, for example, you can write the rationale behind why a certain requirement was added or why it was modified or deleted, okay? The fourth point is that simplest version mechanism is to manually label each revision according to a standard convention. So, you know, like what you have done in your SRS document, you must have written it as, like, because it's the first draft that you have prepared, so you can write it as version 1.0 draft 1, right? And as you work on make any changes in it, so the next one can be titled as, you know, version 1.0 draft 2. So a very manual way, and this is how, like, I mean, we have been trying to, we incorporate this even in our documents or the folders that we keep. So there's always a version 1 or a version 1.1 and all that. So this is how you're going to maintain your you know, the same simplicity of requirements management can be incorporated here as well. And there can also be like, so what you're doing is you're just incrementing the draft number with each iteration until that document is approved, and then it is baselined. So once the document is approved and baselined, and by that I mean, as I just told you previously as well, baselined is that once all the parties have agreed that yes, we have approved it, we agree on it, and we are ready to send it further for development. So that version of the document can be labeled as version 1.0 approved. Okay, so basically you're keeping the same document title, but just giving it this attribute that this is the approved version. And now if that approved version then goes under some minor change, it then becomes version 1.1, draft 1, and so on. Okay, so your book also talks about that if there are some minor revisions to be made or major revisions to be made. So for major, you are going to change the version 1.1 to version 2.0, but I don't think that this is something you really need to follow, as long as whatever you're doing and your team members, they all are on the same page as to how these updates need to take place. That is more important. I'm just quoting an example here from what was mentioned in the book. But obviously it's not like a hard and fast rule that you need to follow that. But keep one thing in mind, that you need to keep a clear distinguishment, if that's any word, or you need to clearly distinguish between your draft and your baseline version. Okay, that everyone needs to know that this was a final document that got approved, and these were the drafts that we were working on before. Okay, and obviously it requires a lot of discipline on all those who are modifying the documents. Okay, now we just talk about how we can manage requirements through requirement attributes. So it says that each requirement is quite unique and distinct and has certain attributes. So we need to think of the requirement basically as an object, which has any object will have some properties that are going to distinguish it from the other objects, right? In the same way, each requirement will have properties that will distinguish them from the other requirements. And how can you distinguish them? On what basis? For example, the way you describe them, their textual description, right? Each requirement will have its own textual description or some supporting piece of information that is quite unique to it, and it's quite different, and will tell you about the attributes of that particular requirement, and that can be counted as its unique attribute, and that's going to differ it from the other requirements. So so it says there, for example, another way you can do it, the date the requirement was created, that's one way that you can distinguish it from the other requirement. Whether it's still current, so what its status is, that's one way, that's an attribute of a requirement, right? That is it deleted, is it deferred, has it been modified, is it still in progress? So even the status tells you about the attribute of the requirement. What other attributes can you think of? The author who created that requirement, right? The priority of that requirement, even that's one attribute of it. The rationale, why, so that comment as to why this requirement was added or modified, that's an attribute, and so on and so forth. We will be talking about the status in the other slide as well. So I just want to tell you that this is these are how you can make your, and I mean, you know that when you write a requirement, you probably have done it. You might have given a name to a specific user case, and you might have given it a certain version number. You might have prioritized it. All these efforts, you're doing it to give it a particular uniqueness, to make it distinct from the other use case or the other functional requirement, right? So, okay, the second point is that a requirements attributes describe the context and the background information for that requirement. So these attributes, what do they help us with? They establish this context and a background for each requirement. And you can store all of this either in a spreadsheet, or you can just write them down in a document, or you have this requirements management tool that you can describe the background information, where you can record all the requirement attributes. So the requirement management tools provide system level attributes, which can be extended with user defined attributes. So, you know, like I was reading that the requirements management tool, now that chapter is actually part of chapter 30. That is requirement management tool is chapter 30 in your book. And that is not part of the course, but if we are able to cover it tomorrow, maybe in the lecture, in the workshop, I think that, because that is like, you need to see the practical version of it, that how those tools are working. Okay, so it's they say that the requirement management tools can help you provide several system generated attributes in addition to letting you define some of the attributes, right? So some of them you can upload or you can populate that table yourself, and some can be generated by the system. It says, and you can start with, and yeah, another point that your book mentioned was that you don't have to overwhelm yourself with with a lot of attributes. So you can just start with 3 or 4 attributes and add others only when you know how they will add value. So for example, one attribute that I find really good is, I mean, the one is like the rationale behind the requirement. Why did we, what was the reason behind adding that requirement, updating that requirement, or modifying that requirement, or deleting that requirement? So that's like one good attribute that should be part of each requirement. Yeah, so it says here that this is an example that I'm going to quote from the book again. So it's a product manager of a company, and they wanted to track which requirements the team included, simply because a competitor's product had the same capability. Okay, so they wanted to, now a very good way as to what you want to track your requirement would be incorporating the attribute of the rationale. Okay, so you write a good way would be that you write a rationale attribute, which is indicating why a specific requirement was included in the product. Okay, and then he says that sometimes what happens is that you include a certain requirement because it is meeting the needs of a particular user group. And later on, your marketing department decides that they don't care about that user group anymore. So having that justification present as a requirement attribute would help everyone on the team decide whether that requirement could be omitted or not. Okay. So yeah, because you see, if you, these real life scenarios where you may be working with conflicting requirements, where you may be under pressure that there is a certain group or a user group saying that they need a certain set of requirements while the other are against that idea, and how that requirement eventually either gets dropped or it gets incorporated, you need to have an attribute, so the rationale attribute in this case, to explain the entire reasoning behind that, that requirement. Okay. The release attribute of requirements may change if left out of a release plan. So if left out of a release plan, okay, and status attribute can help manage a requirement. So status is like, is it still under discussion? Is it approved? Is it deferred? Are we in progress? Are we still working on it? So things like that. These are some of the suggested requirement statuses. So this table is, it's giving you a brief overview of different status that you can use in your documents to tell the basically the status of the requirement. So as you can see, you can start with a proposed requirement, that's something that has been requested by your customer, or something is in progress, or it's being drafted. The initial version of the requirement has been written, or if it's been approved, implemented, verified, was it deferred, was it deleted, rejected, and so on. Sorry. Yes, that's right. You can. Okay. As I said, I mean, the reason why I found this lecture so boring was just that there's so much theory and there's so much things that they're talking common sense, but there's a lot more, as I said, many more software application outside and tools outside, which provide a much more clear understanding. And I'm sure you would be much aware of all these requirement management techniques. So, okay. So coming back to the table, so why do we need these statuses? Why do we need to inform in our requirements a particular status of a requirement? That's because, you see, there's a good chance that not all of these requirements are, number one, of the same importance. They are not of the same size, right? Some of them will consume a higher amount of implementation effort, and some of them will deliver like a higher customer value, and some may deliver the same customer value. So the table is just like, it's just showing you those key words that can track the status of each requirement over time to help you monitor an overall project status. Okay. So, and each requirement will have one of these statuses at any time, okay? So statuses also help you. There's this syndrome, it's called the 90% syndrome, which is that as a business analyst, if you ask your developer, how is the development of the project going on? And he says, oh, I'm 90%, done. But versus if he tells you that, okay, for example, out of the 90 requirements that were allocated to this, let's say 60 of them have been verified, 9 are in the implementation phase, but not yet verified, 17 of them aren't yet completely verified. So just imagine that how much of a difference is in between the two explanations. And as a project manager, you will have a good handle, a better picture of how the development is going on once you hear how the requirements are under different statuses, right? And it also helps the developer as well, actually, the one who is working on those requirements, at what status is each requirement at. So yeah, that's where this table comes in handy. And I think it's really important, because sometimes the developer team, they may get over optimized, and they may say that we will be able to, we are done with 90% of these requirements. But if we are unable to break them down under these different statuses, there's a high chance that we are going to run into the risk of failed requirement delivery. So this means we would be reworking and wasting those precious time and resources. So even for the developer, as well as for his project manager, it's really important that the requirements are discussed according to their status. And when you have put a number, like here, he's clearly defining that these number of like 16 of the requirements are still under implementation and verified, while 9 of them are verified. So the more clear you make it, the more easier it is for the entire project team. Yeah, so this is what we discussed in the last slide as well, that tracking the status of the requirements indicates the project progress, right? There's this very common, they mention it in your book as well, the 90% done syndrome. And your, very optimistic software developer can say, oh, I'm 90% done with this, but in reality, there's a lot yet to be done. So incorporating the tracking of the requirements through a status attached to it is a really good way of managing the requirements. So, yeah. It says here that each requirement can have different statuses at different stages of the product. So status, you can track the status of each requirement throughout the development, and something that is like it was initially approved, and then at what stage you had it implemented or verified, or again when it went back to the draft. So if you're attaching a status to it throughout the development life cycle, it really makes things easy for everyone. Okay, so tracking. And they say that once you have a status attached to a requirement, it also helps you helps the team have an expectation of when that requirement would undergo a complete development life cycle. Okay. So for example, in a certain release of your product, if you're just releasing the first iteration of it, you might plan to implement only certain flows of a use case, for example. And then as you keep on monitoring the status of those, and if you find that those functional requirements that you committed for the current release, they are ready to be implemented and verified, so you can incorporate them in your release, and then that can be declared as a successful release. So rejected requirements, they say rejected requirement records need to be kept as well. Again, it's really important that and valuable that you keep a record of your rejected requirements and the reasons they were rejected. So it's not just a list of the requirements that got rejected, but also the reasons behind them. They're also there. So rejected requirements have a way of resurfacing later during the development or on a future project. Okay, so that's why you need to keep a record of them. And the rejected status lets you keep a proposed requirement available for possible future reference without cluttering up a specific release of the committed requirements. So just by separating them putting the rejected requirements in a separate record, you also help in decluttering the document in which you're working on your committed requirements, right? Okay. Okay, so classifying requirements is meaningful for monitoring. Yeah, and you can classify them into several status categories, and it's more meaningful than trying to monitor the % completion of each requirement, okay, or trying to monitor the complete release baseline. So if you have that status attached to each requirement, that is going to help you in a meaningful monitoring of the requirements as well. Okay, and it says here certain status changes require updates in the trace data. So updating, maybe you need to update a requirement status only when like you have been given some transition conditions, additional transition conditions. So it basically is like as you are making a change to your status, you are also updating it to the requirements tracing tool as well. So you're also telling as to, because the status got updated and there will be a coincided with it, there will be a change maybe in the design, in the coding, in the testing of that requirement. So the status changes, they correspond to all these updates in your tracing tool. Now, there is a traceability matrix that they haven't included in the lecture, but it's part of, I think, chapter 28 or 29 of the book. Again, it's not part of the course, but that that matrix. So basically, what you're doing is, it's a really common way to represent the changes that you are making in your status of the requirement and the changes that you correspondingly make in either the design or the coding or the testing of the requirement. So, okay, now let me see here. Okay, so he says here that it's again like an example from the book. It says here that if you have like a requirements traceability matrix, so it starts with basically a copy of your baseline SRS document, and the project manager, it says he deleted everything except the updated status of the requirements, as well as the corresponding changes made in that in the actions that led to changing the status. So if there was any changes made in the design or the coding, that traceability matrix can help you with the changes. Okay. So yeah, I hope whatever I'm saying is making some sense. The thing is that this chapter that they have included is basically all theoretical, but the practical way of doing it, like showing you the matrix and other like graphs or tools, they're all part of the other chapters. So I'm just trying to make the best explanation of the theory. Okay. This one is, so this one is basically a graphical version of tracking the distribution of the requirement status throughout a project's development lifecycle. So if you look in the key, you can, so this is like a visual monitoring of the status of a set of requirements through a 10-month project, okay? It shows the percentage of all the system's requirements, right? How many are, as you can see on one side, you have the months, on the other side, on the y-axis, you have the percent of requirements. So it shows the percent of all the systems requirement having each status value at the end of each month. So if we track the distribution by percentages, it doesn't show whether the number of requirements in the baseline is changing over time or not. Like, if you look at the number of requirements increases as the scope is added and decreases when the functionality is removed from the baseline. So would anyone like to explain this graph? if there is anyone listening. I'm not sure anyone's out there now. So the thing is, like, this illustration is about how the project is approaching its goal of complete verification of all the approved documents. So if you look at the completely verified line, the dotted line, we are saying that at the end of the 10 months, it should be able to reach the 100% mark, right? If you can follow that. And we can verify those requirements after we have incorporated all the requirements that have been verified, deleted, or deferred. So while your proposed requirements starting from first month, if you see, they are reaching almost like a 90% of the requirements at the end of the first month, and then they start coming down, which means that changes have taken place over the period of time. And same can be said about your approved requirements. The ones by the end of the third or the fourth month, they start going down. And then, so these are how the difference during the course of a month, the status of requirements change. This is how this graph is, this is what it is tracking at the moment. So the implementation, if you see, it's quite curvy, it's quite, and you can see the implementation at the end of the 10 months. So it just touched the 20% mark, and just over and above the 20% mark. And how many of the requirements got deleted? So if you follow the deleted dotted version, in the beginning, obviously there weren't any, and over the period of months, we can see that they grow over the 10% mark. So that's also one way of tracking the status of the requirements. And yeah, I hope you're getting a hang of it. Okay, so I'll just move on. So again, this is like common sense. We are saying resolving requirement issues. So, you know, like numerous questions, decisions, and issues, they arise during the course of a project, right? There are some issues that are like flagged as to be told, to be decided, and then there are some which are pending, there are some requirements that will have some conflict, and we are awaiting some resolution for that, so that all the stakeholders agree on it. So so basically all these kind of potential issues can arise in the course of your project. Potential issues include items flagged as pending, information needed, conflict awaiting resolution. So it's easy to lose sight of these open issues. And by recording these issues in an issue tracking tool, we can let all the stakeholders have access to them, right? Because all of them need to be on the same page as to what status the requirement is at. So keeping the issue tracking and the resolution process simple will help you resolve these requirement issues. So it says that dozens of questions, decisions, issues related to the requirements during a project always remain open. It is important to keep the issue tracking and resolution process simple so the requirements can be kept on track. So what we do, that all the issues and requirements, they are gathered and kept in the record. The project manager can easily track the status of the requirements, and a single owner can be assigned to each issue. So, for example, like, you know, like all of the issues that you log in or that you gather in the project, and they're asking for clarification on the requirement, and there may be some questions about the development feasibility or some scope, that whether these requirements match with the scope or not. So if they're all kept in a record, and there's a single your team member assigned to each issue, then there are discussions held about those issues that can be recorded and traced, and open issues don't become a showstopper for starting a project. So this is basically what we have discussed even before as well, that open issues which need to be resolved, which are still under conflict, it doesn't mean that we can't start a project. We need to stop our project. So we basically need to make sure that all our projects requirements are clear so that we can start our project. There can be several challenges if there is no suitable process of handling the requirement issues. So just imagine that in initial meeting of your requirement elicitation, what happened was that your customer comes up with a very peculiar feature. He says that I want to have a portal incorporated in my new system. Now, while it can happen that if that requirement wasn't recorded, and if it wasn't incorporated in the document, over the coming number of weeks, what can happen is that maybe that requirement wasn't really, it wasn't part of your business development team. And in the first meeting, when your customer had mentioned that desire of incorporating the portal requirement, maybe it was just written on the whiteboard, erased, and never incorporated. So as you come with the first iteration release of your product, and he's asking about the portal, and then you find out that, oh, we thought that we are not going to work on it anymore, and you would ask why, and you would find that it's not there in your document. So that becomes an open issue, that something that your customer was asking for it, and you didn't take it incorporated in your documentation, and it became an issue. So things like these need to be, it's important that you keep an issue tracking so that you can make not just the tracking, but the resolving those issues simple as well. Okay, and look, it can be as simple as making this table. So common types of requirements issues. The issues can relate to the requirement question. Something isn't understood or decided about a requirement. Maybe there's a missing requirement. Maybe there was an incorrect requirement. A requirement was wrong. It should be corrected or removed. An implementation question. So as developers are implementing the requirements, they have some questions about how something needs to work or about design alternatives. And then duplicating of requirements, you might discover you have maybe 2 or more equivalent requirements that need to be discovered, that need to be, like you need to delete, keep one of them, and then some unneeded requirements, and then some requirements like which you didn't incorporate, and whereas your customer had asked for in the beginning. So yeah, so these are some of the requirement issues, and during the requirement elicitation lectures, we have discussed a lot on these topics, that these problems can arise. So obviously we cannot ignore these issues, and they cannot remain open. So we really need to make sure that we are monitoring them and tracking them, whether they have been resolved or not. So we are doing it because the benefits of keeping a track of these issues is, or keeping a history of the discussion really will help everyone, all the team members. So whether it's you are in your business analyst role or your developer, if he has a history of discussion around a certain requirement issue, we can all be on the same page as to what is the current status of the requirement. And as a project manager, of course, you would like to see the current status of all the issues, right? So it's really important that you maintain these requirement issues. You maintain a log of these requirement issues. Okay, so measuring requirements effort. So a project plan should include tasks and resources for requirements management activities. So as it is, we have discussed some, like if you're talking about managing your requirements, then of course you need to put in time and resources. There need to be a culture in your business development team, which puts importance to managing the requirements. And that plan should also, the project plan should also incorporate how you're going to manage the requirements. So we have discussed about making sure that everyone in the team knows that we also need to talk about putting an attribute of the requirements and what those attributes can be, and what are the minimum, say 3 or 4 attributes that we expect all the team members to mention against a requirement whenever they're working for it, right? So being on the same page, having a common understanding of what resources are we putting in managing our requirements. That's really important. Measuring the effort requires a culture change and the individual discipline to record the daily work, right? So I think more important, and that's really an important point, because many people make it, in your team may have a fear of how they can track the requirement. So, but if there is a culture in your team where they all agree that these tasks that we are going to include as part of a requirement management, they are going to provide us with with a valuable insight, from knowing how we have to track our requirement and any issue related to the requirement, then it really helps. So they should know that how they're going to spend their time on requirement management compared to, you can always have an open discussion that how maybe your team fears that maybe by incorporating the management of a requirement, I'm going to waste my time. But putting them all on the same page, that what they think and how it's actually going to take place, that is really going to help them get disciplined to work on this. Okay. The next is, it is valuable to separate the time spent by a business analyst and the time spent by other project participants, the total cost of the requirements. Okay, so measuring the requirement effort also involves that you are separating the time that you are spending on managing the requirement, because that is going to give you a good idea of how much, what the total cost of that requirement is. So something that is at the implementation phase and you are finding out that it needs rework will obviously carry a high cost to your project, rather than something that you have managed in the initial phases of your requirement. So then it says that requirements development effort, that is planning, holding workshops, writing the SRS, prototyping, reviewing. So just see, I mean, this is what the entire our course has been about. We have been talking about these steps in every week, and we have been talking about at length about them. So all these stages of the requirements framework are in an effort to make sure that you are managing your requirements well as well. And the other thing is requirement management. That was your development effort, basically. And your management effort is all about configuring, tracking, change controls, version controls, involving the attributes, the statuses. So they are part of your requirement management effort. While your development effort, like before this lecture, all that we have talked about was all about how we can help develop good quality requirements. All right. So Agile, you have been incorporating that in even in your these projects that you are working on, and you know a lot about Agile projects, how they differ with as compared to the waterfall approach. And Agile projects, you know, they have a backlog and they work a lot through repeated iterations, and they're quite open to going back and forth. So something that is at implementation phase even, and you find that there's a certain thing that is still unclear, so you can eventually go back, get things analyzed, and get them clear. So the Agile project management requirements, they occur mainly through backlogs, and the requirements are converted into user stories that are added to a dynamic backlog, which is, so everything, as you know, in Agile is dynamic, right? There's nothing fixed that once this portion is done, we are not going back to it. So you are having a backlog which is quite dynamic, where you are putting your user stories, you are updating them, you are prioritizing them as the work is going on. So the requirements are converted into user stories that are added to a dynamic backlog to be allocated to future releases. So there are many user stories that you may not be working on in the current iteration of the product or the application that you're working on. So they will be part of a dynamic backlog, and they can be part of your future releases. An Agile team always works high on the high priority stories. Again, we have discussed this a lot and you have, even in the document that you have made, you have prioritized your use cases. So there will be certain use cases that you will be giving the maximum priority, the high priority, and so on and so forth. So these are all reflective of the Agile software approach. User stories and backlogs are better kept in a tool. Each of the user stories can have a status like the requirements. All right. So remember, like some of the statuses that we have discussed, you can actually, for the requirements that we discussed, you can actually have the same status approach give to your user stories. So which user story is in progress, which is now in development, has been approved, is going to be implemented, verified, which has been rejected, deferred. So just attaching that status to the user story is a really good way of managing your Agile projects. Okay, Agile projects monitor their progress with an iteration burn down chart. This is going to be discussed in the next slide. And the next is that a team allocates a number of stories to each iteration that you're all aware of, story points and release numbers. Okay, this is, they are plotted to draw a burn down chart that provides the visibility of a project's progress. So the burn down chart is a visible representation of your project's progress in an Agile approach. Okay, so why not we just go straight to this visual representation. So this is what it is. This is a burn down chart, and it's just like a sample iteration of so in each iteration can actually come up with a burn down chart. A burn down chart is a graphical representation of the work remaining for a project and the time remaining to complete it. Okay. Now, burn down charts, they are specially used in Agile project approach, and there are several components of a burn down chart. Here, what you see is like a line plotting, but there's one that you can also use a bar chart as well. And let's discuss the X and the Y axis. So the agile teams, they use a metric called story points. They will tell you the time which is remaining for the project, and the iteration is that the tasks needed to complete it. So for example, a project can, may have 30 days until the deadline, and they may have 40 tasks to complete. So, but let's discuss this version that we have in front of us. It's a snapshot of like a hypothetical project. So the story points, if you see the dots here, they basically measure the scope that is remaining. Now, if you see the iteration, it actually increases. The story point actually increases in iteration 2, 3, and number 5, right? So here, what it is showing is, what it is displaying to you is that maybe that new functionality was added to the backlog, and like more functionalities were added than were completed or removed during the course of the iteration. Now, this kind of graphical representation is a really helpful way of avoiding that 90% done syndrome, which, team members, your developers might get mistaken that they might quite optimistic that they have done quite a portion of the work, but it turns out that a lot is still yet to be done before the iteration can be released. So what it does is, this chart, by making visible the amount of work that is remaining as opposed to the amount of work completed, right? So this all shows the amount of work that is remaining. So at the end of the 10th iteration, we find that there is 0 story point to work on, right? And it's ready for its final delivery. So that can really help the developers, because they really need to be on toes on how much work is left and how long will it take. Okay. And yeah, this is quite commonly used in all the agile projects. So this basically here covers the chapter that was assigned for this lecture. And now we come to something which was in the it's from chapter 30, this diagram, and it's talking about the requirement management tools. So you see there's a baseline requirement management tools, and there are how you can capture the requirement, how you manage them, and what are the tools you need to, for example, if you need any support within a tool like the help tool, how can you, the tools that you need to trace the requirement, and the tools that you need for output of the requirement. So for example, in the output, what do? You create a report, right? That you have already done. And maybe as you go further in your upcoming courses, you're going to integrate some testing tools as well in your report. And then comes the development tools and some other tools. So helping, with the output of that requirement can be through all these kind of different tools. So while taking this output of requirement in relation to the requirement management tool. So for example, you can incorporate like a version control tool to your output, or like an issue tracking tool, or a change request tool, right? So that is something that you can incorporate in your output. Then how can you trace your requirements? So they are talking about associate requirements to the models, and you, in tracing, like you trace the requirement dependencies, how the requirements are dependent on each other. and then how can you access the help tool, that support within a tool, if training is needed by the team, and if they are working on, like, your developers feel that they don't have the the skill to work on on incorporating a certain requirement. So this is basically, like, I think this was, I was planning to discuss even tomorrow in the workshop as well, that how the requirement management tools can be part of your overall requirement engineering framework. So because it's ending up with an exercise that we thought we can do tomorrow. And this is the, so yeah, requirement management tool. These are some of the tools that are part of the requirement management tool here. So the version control we have discussed, test management tool, change request tool, so how you can request for changes, track those changes, issue tracking tool, any open issues that are in the requirements. This tool is going to help deal with that. And of course, the development tool that we have been, a major chunk of this course was allocated to capturing and developing those requirements. So yeah, I think I'm going to just end here and talk at length about this tomorrow. And yeah, that's about it. Your the projects that are part of this course, they do not really inculcate any prototyping or any management of this. So, but this is where we are going to sort of end up the requirement engineering framework with this lecture. So yeah, that's all from my side for now. And I'm going to see you tomorrow in the workshop.